Some of the things that we have going on this morning, in about 20 minutes or so, we're going to be joined by Dr. Jonathan Tripp from Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls, Idaho. He'll be taking some of your telephone calls as well on our segment called Better Health. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those nicks and bruises you often get on an almost daily basis for some of us who are perhaps, I think we were called klutzes when we were kids. It might be because we're nearsighted and you walk by a table and you don't always figure out the distance between you and the wooden corner. But we'll talk a little bit about some of those details and things you should be on the lookout for if that could become something progressively worse. Also, in the next hour, Rebecca Milsoika is scheduled to join us from the Twin Falls City Council. We'll spend a few minutes with her, see what's going on in city government, if we have anything new or exciting, or perhaps a big festival coming up that you'd like to know about, so you might be able to attend that. And lastly, I'd like to open up the program today talking about a couple of environmental issues. I know it doesn't seem like a global warming day out there. If you've been outside already today, you know what I'm talking about. It is windy, it is cold, it's a biting wind. And it is supposed to, move out, and then we'll have some wind again this weekend, but we'll have a lot warmer weather when that comes around. In fact, our weather after today is on an incredible upswing. By the next several days, we'll be seeing temperatures almost consistently in the 70s. So just put that one away and know things are gradually getting better this time of year. 8 minutes after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you this morning. 31 at our studios, and I want to welcome you to Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. The Associated Press had this story on the wire today, and it came out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. I spent one night in Cheyenne at a motel. Did I ever share this story on the trip here? Second night, I stayed in Cheyenne, and I stayed at a motel, and I didn't know it at the time. I saw some railroad tracks running right by the motel. The second floor of the motel has a wraparound balcony, which looks more like a rail platform. That's how close the railroad tracks are. And I didn't know it until about 3 o'clock in the morning that the trains start moving back and forth, and you hear all the clanging and banging and that going on. And of course, it was a cheap overnight. It wasn't an expensive place to stay. It wasn't like a 5-star hotel by any means. But still, you did not expect that you were going to be waking up at 3 a.m. to the sounds of train cars being decoupled or coupled. And it was a little bit of a surprise. So I would not recommend that for anyone, and I didn't see anything of Cheyenne in daylight, so I can't tell you any impressions of the city, other than the fact it was dark when I got there and it was dark when I left there, because I was on the road by 4:30 after my wake-up call from the train. National conservation groups are mustering opposition to the rising call in many western states to transfer federal lands to state control. The U.S. Senate last month narrowly approved a budget amendment sponsored by Alaska Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski that would allow future legislation to sell or transfer federal lands to state or local governments. Conservation groups say, and I'm jumping down to the bottom of the page here, they're working to alert hunters and anglers to the threat of loss of access to federal lands. First of all, if the land suddenly becomes state land versus federal land, does that necessarily exclude people who are hunting and fishing? I don't think so. In fact, I think that you may actually have more land opened up to actually hunt and fish. And I know people who've been hunting for years and fishing for years, and most of them seem to have no problem finding some prime spots and going ahead and doing that. But here's the thing. A lot of the people who are hunting and fishing would proclaim to be fairly conservative people in their personal lives and when they go vote. But it does strike me that as a special interest group, that those who are making the most noise about a potential loss of land for their hobbies and their exercise, potential loss of land, it doesn't really take into account everybody else. And I would say that a lot of these organizations, these so-called conservation groups, who really aren't interested in conserving trees or grass or a lot of the other things out there, they're just mainly concerned about keeping their playground open. And they would do that to the detriment of the rest of us. In fact, if opening up federal lands in a place like Idaho or Nevada or Wyoming would actually create 1 million jobs, these people would be screaming about that? I don't really understand that. I find it to be a rather selfish notion that they have. It's funny. I do know a lot of conservatives because of the nature of the work that I do, but I'm going to tell you right off the top of the program today that I feel that a great many of them believe that government should be a tool to control people and to ensure that they get what they want, which is a very liberal notion. 12 minutes after 8 o'clock, 31 at our studios. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. Our telephone number is 736-0300. Or you can email me at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. We have our first caller of the morning, and you're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
Listen, my little community college graduate, last time that there was a fire up there and I was 20
Community college? Where did you get that? I have a degree from the State University of New York, and I actually have a year of graduate school atop that.
From NYU? Okay.
No, not NYU. New York State University. NYU is the university for the liberals in New York City.
Yeah, okay. Listen.
Well, if you're going to insult me right off the top, forget it. Again, the telephone number, 736-0300. 736-0300. You can reach us at any particular point. 12 minutes after 8 o'clock now. Bill Colley with you. Again, I just... He's not being nice to me. Well, you know what? You call up and you insult me at the top of the phone call. You're not going to get a hearing. I'm sorry. The liberals out there all say that I'm the one that's mean, but obviously I opened up that telephone call expecting to have a pretty nice conversation, and all I get is some lip. From a guy, by the way, as I understand it, who has absolutely no support among this listening audience and obviously among his neighbors. And, of course, we all paid his way through school. I primarily paid mine. We have another caller with us. You're up next, and you're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And what's on your mind?
Good morning, sir. Oh, just my experience hunting last year. I was up in the Sawtooths, and a lot of the Forest Service, had closed off the lower roads and lower accesses where people could go camping, and they were cutting all these trees down. They want to tell us we can't cut down green trees, but that's exactly what they're cutting, is little, small, green poles. I don't know what they're using them for. All the stuff has signs on it for sale by the Forest Service, but yet we, the people who actually own the land, cannot go there and harvest the wood, and they're doing it. And they're closing off all the accesses and all the access roads. And I got a lovely speech from a Forest Service lady about, well, you guys really don't need to be going up in the mountains to do anything with the ground up there. I'm thinking to myself, this is ridiculous. So, anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you much for the call. Yes, we're here to serve you. Now get out of our way. Get off the land. We have another caller with us. You're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Hi, Bill. The thing about the land, I know where they're going to go with this thing when they're talking about the fires. How's the state of Idaho going to come up with the money to fight the fires? And my thing is, who was here 200 years ago to fight the Blue Moon fires, and we had forests then? So that's not an issue. Now, I realize we got homes and all that stuff that they build up in the mountains, and everybody wants those beautiful cabins and stuff. Well, there's a risk that comes with it. The rest of us normal people live down here in the valley where we don't have problems with fires. But if you're going to build up there, don't expect us to pay and cover for your nice homes that you decide to put up there in the forest. You're going to have to protect yourself somehow.
Yeah, and I would say that the forest fires that have occurred generally are natural, and the result after a forest fire usually is that the earth replenishes itself. And in fact, there's actually some good that comes out of that. But this notion that, well, you can't afford to pay for forest fires on your own. Look, we either pay the federal government or we pay the state government, right? It doesn't really matter. We're paying taxes, whether you pay them out of your right pocket or your left pocket, you're still paying taxes. You're going to cover it one way or another.
Yep, very good.
Hey, thank you much for the call, sir. It's 8:15 now. Still 32 now at our studios. Just as I was speaking, we got a spike in our temperature. We're back at the freezing point. Isn't that some good news? To give you an idea about environmentally what we're talking, some of this, comes up obviously during any conversation about federal lands. And the notion that somehow some guy in Washington is smarter and knows better than somebody in Boise or Twin Falls still always surprises me. Well, I'm a bureaucrat, so therefore, I don't care. You're somebody who had a relative in government, and you couldn't find a job, so your relative in government got you a job, and that's why we're at this point. We listen to these people supposedly because they're the experts, but I'm sorry, a lot of these people are just simply civil servants, and they're trying to maintain and keep their own jobs. And in order to do that, they have to promulgate regulations, because if they didn't, then somebody would say, well, what are you doing? And if you're not doing anything, sorry, we don't need you. So we get all of these regulations and rules simply so we can continue, and you got a phony economy out of it because government's trying to suck all of our money away and all of our resources away in order to provide what you might call patronage to various people who keep certain people in government. You're on the air next, 8:17. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story.
Yeah, as you talk about the government, they are, and when we say in Idaho, well, we can't afford those federal lands, well, our federal government can't afford those federal lands. We are borrowing and we are printing money to pay for those. Why do we think that they are in any different shape? And we can, like you said, bring in new jobs. So I just think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, thank you much for the call. Government takes in half of what it spends. So at some point, it's got to come crumbling down. It just can't continue forever. A couple of weeks ago, it's barely been reported by establishment media in this country. The Chinese have opened up their own banking system, which is to work internationally with other countries. And a lot of our even longest allies, old line allies, are just abandoning us for this new Chinese banking system. And when that happens ultimately, and even though the dollar is high flying right now and its value around the world, don't be surprised if all of a sudden when it's no longer the world's reserve currency, we cannot spend twice what we actually bring in. People aren't going to continue to give us a line of credit when that happens. And when things come crashing down, you will not have money for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, federal lands, roads, all of those things. We're going to have to learn to prioritize. And when that happens, a lot of people out there are going to realize who've been getting a government check, even if you think you deserve it, it's not going to be there anymore. And Americans, I think a lot of them have gone along thinking, well, if we just eliminated fraud and waste, okay, so you eliminate that little tiny portion of the budget, which might be a couple of $100 billion, then what do you do about the other several trillion? And there seems to be a notion that there is just so much fraud and waste that if we eliminated all of that, then we would balance the budget. It's not going to happen. We would still be spending far more than we bring in. We've got a moment for a break coming up. A couple of notes I should make, too. For our first caller today, I actually, like him, I have a 4-year degree. Not that I'm bragging about it. I don't know that it makes me any smarter than anyone else out there. And then I went to graduate school at the State University of New York in Buffalo. And if I had to suffer through that, I think I get some credit because I had to drive in that nasty winter weather there during that course of that year that I was in school. 20 minutes after 8 o'clock, Bill Colley with you. And again, I came out of college knowing how to speak English. 32 at our studios. Speaking of environment, got some news about this global warming facade coming up in just a moment, which I'll share with you because I think it relates to what's going on in parts of Idaho. 3 counties already under a drought relief, and of course California in a much worse position. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story. A quick note, if you've been following the Aaron Hernandez trial in Massachusetts, he is the former tight end for the New England Patriots who was accused of murder. He is guilty. A verdict is in. He is guilty. This was a guy who had tremendous talent. Could have been one of the best ever in the game. Unfortunately, he couldn't escape his thuggish background and continued to live as if he was a member of a street gang while making millions of dollars. And he has discovered very quickly, of course he's poker-faced in court right now as this is all coming down, but he has discovered very quickly that you can make a lot of money, but if you're still a hoodlum, you got to pay the price. 824, Bill Colley with you this morning, 32 at our studios. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. The show is Top Story. Dr. Jonathan Tripp coming up in just a few minutes. Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine following the break at 8:30. The doctor will be in studio with us until 9 o'clock this morning. He's available to take your telephone calls as well. You got a problem, health issue? He'll do his best to try and address that because he's in family practice. I have a story that I looked at today, and it made me think a little bit about all of the warnings we are getting out of places like California and even in our region where we're talking about some drought. Not as severe here, obviously, in Idaho, as it has been out to our west. But check this out. There is a publication called Mosaic Magazine, and I get it online every morning, and I happen to come across this story. And it's talking about a severe drought that struck part of the world, Greece, Egypt, the Levant, which is today Israel, and many of your Arab countries in the Middle East, and even the area around Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq. This drought struck the area between 1250 and 1100 BC. Well, they say BCE. Mosaic is a Jewish publication. BC for the rest of us. BCE is just before the Common Era. BC, of course, for the rest of us means before Christ. The writer says in the early 12th century, the civilizations of Egypt, and now again, 12th century BC, the civilizations of Egypt, Greece, the Levant, and Mesopotamia experienced some sort of major catastrophe. For a long time, historians pointed at the invasion of marauders known as the Sea Peoples, who, by the way, could not have come in large numbers because, it wasn't like they had great big steel battleships at the time that they could come rolling across the Mediterranean in. They were using small boats. So these would have been small raids, and they would have perhaps, taken out a couple of villages here and there, but they really could not have taken down entire societies. Recent high-resolution pollen analysis of a core taken from the Sea of Galilee has irrefutably shown that the years between 1250 and 1150 BCE were the driest seen throughout the Bronze and Iron Ages. Climate change. Now, if we could take a moment and think about this. We have people out there who are telling us that we are going through these severe problems with our weather right now because we have too many cars, we drive too many cars, we have too many smokestacks, we burn too much coal, we burn too much oil, we burn too much natural gas. Natural gas probably would play a very, very small role in that. And we just have too dang many people on the planet. And yet, back in that era, there were far fewer human beings around. No one was driving automobiles. There were very few people burning coal, if any. They may have been burning more dung than anything else, and they weren't here in large numbers, so that would not have had a huge impact. There were no smokestacks, and yet there was this period, this dry period, and it lasted, again, from 1250 before the Common Era to 1100, so 150 years of tremendously dry weather. The fossil record also shows us that in California that they have had droughts that have lasted up to 200 years at a time in the past. Some people are saying the current drought there could be a 30-year drought. None of this is unusual. The only thing we have, as a caller pointed out earlier when we were talking about the forest land, there was a time when we had forest fires and nobody noticed. Now you've got these big expensive homes and cabins up in the mountains, and people get all bent out of shape if there's a forest fire, but these are naturally occurring things. But to sit here and try to say that man is responsible for what we're seeing in California, only to the point that there might be 40 million people in California, most of them living in the South, and they're having a difficult time getting water to them. But Phoenix is in the desert. Phoenix gets water to the people. Albuquerque is in the desert. They managed 500 some odd thousand people in Albuquerque. They have figured out how to do it. You've got Las Vegas, which is a massive city now with all the growth. And people there are still getting water. So it can be done. But I'm just telling you right now that it's not man-made, other than the fact that you've got a lot of people living on some land where they probably haven't in the past had a lot of water. And they have to figure out how to get it there now, or those people will have to move. And if they do the latter, and I have a gut feeling, if a lot of people end up leaving California, they're going to be going to places like, well, Idaho, because the tax structure here isn't bad. There is a lot of open land. But if they start coming in huge droves, that's what we may not be prepared for, because I brought this subject up last week when we had a member of the Twin Falls City Council in the studio. What happens if they come in such large numbers that we don't have the water here any longer to supply everyone? Now, that's another question we have to consider as well, and maybe now is the time to start just wargaming. It may never happen in that sense. We may never get more than a few more thousand people living in Twin Falls County. 20, 25, 30,000 more people. Maybe that's where it ends. But on the other hand, should we be planning just as a contingency? So we have a system in place. If we suddenly ended up with a few 100,000 people or more coming here and thinking, okay, we'll come here and settle instead. Just a thought. Dr. Jonathan Tripp coming up in a couple of minutes with us from Tripp Family Medicine. Hope you can join us on Better Health. He'll be taking some of your telephone calls as well. This is Top Story with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX.